The gunshot came before the knock did. One shattered the morning quiet over Silver Creek. The other, softer, almost polite, rattled the front door of a ranch house that hadn't seen a visitor in 9 years. Ruth Calloway didn't move for the door. She moved for the rifle above the mantel first, because in this territory in this year, a knock before sunrise meant only one of two things: trouble or the past. And Ruth had learned the hard way that they usually arrived wearing the same face. When she finally opened the door, there was no stranger standing on her porch. There was a 14-year-old boy, blood soaking through the shoulder of his shirt, and a folded piece of paper clenched so tight in his fist that his knuckles had gone white. "They said if I made it here alive," he gasped, "you'd know what to do with this." Ruth unfolded the paper with hands that had not shaken in 9 years, not once, not through a husband's funeral. Not through 2 winters that should have killed her, not through anything. They shook now because the handwriting on that page belonged to a man the whole county had buried a decade ago, a man Ruth herself had watched them lower into the ground. If you want to know what happens when the dead start writing letters, and what one Wyoming widow does when a debt she thought was closed comes back asking to be paid in blood, stay with me tonight. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from. This is the story of Silver Creek, and it starts 9 years before that boy ever knocked on Ruth Calloway's door. To understand why a dead man's handwriting could put a rifle back in Ruth Calloway's hands, you have to go back 9 years. To a spring so dry that the whole of Silver Creek County watched their wells drop an inch a week and prayed to a sky that gave them nothing back. Ruth was 26 that year, married 3 seasons to a man named Josiah Calloway, a horse trader with an easy laugh and a harder secret. Though Ruth wouldn't understand the size of that secret until it was far too late to matter. Josiah didn't just trade horses. On the quiet, in the months the drought bled the county dry, he'd taken to running something else across the territory line for a man named Elias Voss, a cattle broker out of Laramie whose ledgers, if anyone had ever thought to open them, would have shown considerably more debt collection than honest trading. Voss didn't lend money, he lent obligation. An obligation in Elias Voss's hands had a way of never quite being paid off. Josiah owed him for a herd that died of blackleg 2 winters running, bad luck dressed up as bad debt, the way it so often is out on the range. And when a man can't pay in dollars, Elias Voss had a particular talent for finding some other currency to collect instead. What he asked of Josiah that spring, Ruth never learned the whole truth of, not then. All she knew was that her husband left for Laramie on a Tuesday in April, promising to be home within the week, and that 6 days later, 2 riders she'd never seen before brought his horse back to the ranch without him. They told her there'd been an accident on the trail, a fall, a broken neck, nothing anyone could have done. They told her where he was buried, a small plot outside Laramie, too far for her to visit more than once that whole first year, grieving a grave she'd barely seen with her own eyes. What Ruth didn't know, because Elias Voss had built his whole operation on precisely this kind of quiet, careful lie, was that the man in that grave wasn't her husband at all. Josiah Calloway was alive. He'd been alive the whole 9 years Ruth spent raising their daughter alone on a shrinking ranch, alive through every hard winter she rode out on her own. Alive through every year she told herself grief was simply something a person learned to carry rather than something that ever truly healed. He'd been alive, and he'd been Elias Voss's ledger man, the price Voss demanded instead of dollars Josiah didn't have. A man good with numbers, good with roots. Good at knowing exactly which sheriffs in exactly which counties could be paid to look elsewhere when Voss's cattle crossed a line they had no legal right to cross. Voss staged the death himself. A body, a drifter nobody in 3 counties would come looking for, dressed in Josiah's coat, buried under Josiah's name, while the real Josiah Calloway rode north into a decade of quiet. Coerced service told again and again that if he ever tried to walk away, if he ever tried to send so much as a single word back to Silver Creek, the wife and daughter he'd left behind would be the ones who paid for it. So Josiah stayed silent. 9 years of silence, buying safety for a family who believed him dead. While Elias Voss's operation grew from cattle theft into something considerably darker, land fraud dressed up in false surveys, homestead claims filed under dead men's names. An entire county's worth of paperwork quietly rotting from the inside. By 1885, Josiah Calloway had become something he barely recognized in his own reflection. And when he finally learned that Voss meant to move against Silver Creek itself, filing a fraudulent claim that would strip half the valley's ranchers, including his own wife, off land they'd worked for a generation, he understood that 9 years of silence had bought his family nothing but time. And that time had just run out. He couldn't ride to Ruth himself. Voss's men watched him too closely for that. So he wrote a letter instead, in the same hand Ruth would have known blind in a pitch-dark room, and pressed it into the palm of the only person he trusted to outrun a bullet, a stable boy named Tommy who'd shown him more loyalty in 6 months than Voss had earned in 9 years of fear. "Ride for Silver Creek," Josiah told him. "Ride like your life depends on it, because hers does," which brings us back to that porch. To Ruth Calloway, rifle in one hand, her dead husband's living handwriting in the other, and a bleeding boy on her doorstep telling her that everything she'd buried 9 years ago was about to walk back into her life whether she was ready for it or not. The letter told her 3 things: that Josiah was alive, that Elias Voss meant to steal Silver Creek out from under every family in the valley within the month, using forged land claims no one had thought to check closely enough, and that the only proof strong enough to stop him, the real survey records, the real ownership deeds, kept hidden for years in a lockbox Josiah himself had buried before he was ever taken north, sat under the floorboards of the very house Ruth was standing in. She had told herself for 9 years that she'd made peace with being a widow. Standing on that porch, letter shaking in her hand, Ruth understood she'd never made peace with anything at all. She'd simply survived it, the way a person survives a winter they don't remember choosing to walk through. She looked down at Tommy, pale from blood loss, and made the decision that would define the next 3 weeks of her life. "Get him inside," she said to her daughter, who'd come running at the sound of voices, "and saddle the mare. We've got a floor to tear up, and a husband to bring home." The lockbox was exactly where the letter said it would be, buried beneath the kitchen floorboards Josiah had pulled up himself the week before he died, wrapped in oilcloth to survive 9 years of Wyoming winters undisturbed. Inside it, Ruth found the original survey records for every ranch in the valley, signed and witnessed years before Elias Voss's men had begun quietly filing false paperwork claiming otherwise. Proof, plain and undeniable, that Voss's entire land grab rested on documents that wouldn't survive an honest look from anyone with the authority to compare them side by side. What she needed now wasn't just the truth. She needed a living witness brave enough to speak it in front of the whole county, and the only man who could do that was 3 days' ride north. Still believing his silence was the only thing keeping his family safe. Ruth rode for him herself, not the version of herself who'd spent 9 years believing grief was something to be managed quietly at a kitchen table. The version who'd broken ice on frozen water troughs at 4 in the morning through winters that should have broken her. Who'd learned to read a ledger and mend a fence and bury her own fear so deep her daughter never once saw it crack. She found Josiah 3 days later at a line shack outside the Voss operations northern camp, thinner than she remembered, older in the eyes than 9 years should have made him. For a long moment, neither of them said a word, the same particular silence, it turns out. That settles over 2 people who once knew every inch of each other's lives and now have to learn each other again from the outside in. "You should have run the first year," Ruth finally said. "Instead of staying silent for 9, I stayed silent," Josiah said, "because I thought silence was the only thing keeping you and Mary alive. I was wrong, I understand that now. I should have trusted you to fight beside me instead of trying to protect you from a fight you never got the choice to walk away from." Ruth didn't answer that with words. She answered it by handing him the lockbox and telling him exactly what it would take to bring Elias Voss's 9 years of careful lies down in a single afternoon. The county land hearing was set for the following Tuesday, held in the same meeting hall where Silver Creek settled every dispute that mattered. Elias Voss arrived expecting a formality, a rubber stamp on paperwork he'd spent a decade building. No one left alive who both knew the truth and had the nerve to speak it. He got neither. Josiah Calloway walked into that hall very much alive, 9 years dead in the eyes of every person in the room, and laid the original survey records on the table before Voss had finished his opening claim. The hall went silent the way a room only goes silent when the ground beneath everyone's assumptions shifts all at once. Voss didn't reach for a weapon. Men like Voss rarely do their own dirty work in public. That had always been the quiet genius of his cruelty, staying clean-handed while everyone around him paid the price of his ambition. But when the county sheriff, presented with 9 years of falsified filings laid out plain on a table, asked Voss to account for the discrepancy, Voss had no honest answer left to give. He was arrested before the hearing adjourned. His operation, unraveled thread by thread over the following months, revealed a decade of stolen land and coerced men stretching across 3 counties. Josiah Calloway, it turned out, had not been the only one silenced into service. Silver Creek kept its land. Every family whose deed Voss had tried to quietly steal woke the following spring still holding what was rightfully theirs. And Ruth Calloway got back the husband the county had buried 9 years too early, older than the man she'd married, carrying 9 years of guilt he'd spend the rest of his life working to set down. But alive and finally fully, honestly hers again. And there, friends, is where we leave Silver Creek, a family reunited not by luck, but by a woman who refused to let 9 years of grief be the last word on her own story. What stays with me about Ruth and Josiah isn't just the reunion, sweet as it is. It's the 9 years Ruth spent surviving alone, never once knowing the truth, and how she still found the strength to ride north the moment she finally did. That's not luck. That's the kind of courage most of us hope we'd find in ourselves and never quite know until we're tested. If there's something worth carrying home tonight, I think it's this: the truth doesn't always arrive when we're ready for it. Sometimes it arrives bleeding on our doorstep at sunrise. What matters is what we do the moment it does. Thank you for spending this evening with me, wherever in the world you're listening tonight. If Ruth and Josiah's story found its way into your heart, stay close. There are more like it waiting in the quiet corners of the Old West. Until next time, friends, hold on a little tighter to the people you love, and never let silence do the talking when the truth is what's needed most.